So let's start. So a warm welcome to all of you who have joined us today. I know we have a group of people in Thailand, both Thai people and Swedish people living in Thailand, and we have participants from Sweden as well. So a warm welcome to all of you. We're very happy that so many of you took the time in this busy pre-Christmas schedule to join us today to learn more and discuss how we can do more to protect children during COVID-19. One thing we do know is that children who were at risk before COVID are at increased risks now, and it's more important than ever that we act. I think you all have heard the reports about increased risks for children both during the lockdowns and now again when the world slowly starts to reopen and international traveling is resuming. There are risks, and you will hear about them soon, but there are also things that you can do to reduce the vulnerability of children, and that will be in the focus for our conversation today. You who attend may have visited a pub street in Bangkok and seen a young child selling flowers late at night and felt that this does not feel right, but then looked away. You may have heard of friends spending their winters in Phuket, talking about a man who uses to invite local boys to his house to use his swimming pool. And your friend saying that this doesn't feel right, but he didn't want to interfere. You may be Thai and been in a situation where you've seen a foreign man picking up a very young girl on the street, but chose not to report because you didn't think it would matter. But it does matter. It does matter what you do and what you don't do. My name is Britta Holmberg. I'm the Deputy Secretary General and Program Director of World Childhood Foundation, an organization founded by Her Majesty Queen Sylvia of Sweden with a purpose to prevent sexual abuse and exploitation of children. We work in Sweden, in Thailand, and many other countries and regions that are extremely different but share similar risks for children. We always work in partnerships, which is why I'm very happy that today we're organizing this webinar together with key partners of ours, the Embassy of Sweden, ECPAT Sweden, the HUG organization, and the Swedish Ambassador at Large for combating trafficking and sexual exploitation of children. I also hope that among those of you who have joined us today, we may find new allies in the fight against child sexual abuse. The webinar is organized as part of a collaboration between us at Childhood, ECPAT Sweden, the Swedish Police and the Authority for Gender Equality, and the organization Friends International. The projects Say What You Saw, we can show, well, is generously funded by the Swedish Postcode Lottery, and our aim is to combat child sexual exploitation in travel and tourism through increased reporting of suspected exploitation, especially when it concerns Swedish offenders abusing children abroad. We will record the webinar. We will record the webinar and share afterwards on our platform. So if you want to share with your friends and colleagues, you're most welcome to do so. And we can just quickly show the agenda for the webinar, Jeanette. Yes, exactly with that slide. But now I'm handing over to you, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you so much, Britta, and good afternoon and good morning to all of you. Sawadee from Bangkok. I wish you all warmly welcome to this webinar, Protecting Children During COVID-19, What Can You Do? Let me begin by noting how many have joined this webinar today. It is such an important topic and your engagement is a testament to that. It is not only an important topic, but also one that stirs up emotions in many of us. More than many other abuses, I believe, since children, sometimes very young, are the targets. As many of you already would know, protecting and promoting the rights of the child is and has been for a long time a top Swedish priority. Sweden played a leading role in the work on the Convention on the Rights of the Child and was one of the first countries to ratify it. In 2018, the government of Sweden adopted a bill on making the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child Swedish law. This means that children will be in greater focus in situations that concerns them. Also, Sweden has twice made recommendations to Thailand on corporal punishment of children in the human rights peer review process, the so-called Universal Periodic Review. The still very much ongoing COVID-19 pandemic is a universal crisis, and for some children, the impact will be lifelong. Many children are gravely affected physically, emotionally, and psychologically, especially in countries such as Thailand that have declared states of emergencies, mandatory lockdowns, and long school closures. As always in a crisis, the most vulnerable are the ones who are the hardest hit. The everyday lives of many girls have been overturned by the pandemic. Their physical and mental health, their education, and the economic circumstances of their families and communities. It is especially this last aspect, the dire economic situation, that is an aggravating factor in terms of children being exposed to risk of sexual exploitation and abuse. At the embassy in Bangkok, we have a police attaché of the section for the Nordic Liaison Office, working collectively with Nordic countries and Thailand in ending sexual exploitation and abuse of children. Unfortunately, the Nordic Liaison Office is noticing worrying regional trends in relation to the trafficking and sexual exploitation of children as a result of increased desperation caused by the pandemic, most notably in relation to increased criminal activities in relation to online sexual exploitation of children. The Nordic Liaison Office work operationally with regional law enforcement in order to find abusers, facilitators, and assist in rescuing victims of sexual exploitation. In order to identify victims and perpetrators, NGOs and the general public are key players in order to hopefully see, hear, and discover, find and transmit any information suggesting abuse of children to Nordic law enforcement. The Nordic Liaison Office can then mount operations together with Thai law enforcement in order to investigate, both in the Nordic countries and locally, and possibly arrest suspects and rescue victims. Since NGOs are the eyes and the ears in local communities, adequate training of staff and heightened awareness of the problem, along with positive law enforcement cooperation and communication, are key factors in order to identify predators and one of the roads to take for more positive results in combating human trafficking and sexual exploitation of children. During this meeting, during this morning or afternoon, depending on where you are, we will hear from the Swedish Ambassador for Combating Trafficking, Mrs. Anna Ekstedt. We will hear from the Chiang Mai-based organization HUG, and also Childhood Foundation and ECPAT. I hope that we will be able to talk concretely on what we can do as individuals and representatives for various organizations and groups to play our part in putting an end to the abuse of children. Let us also remind ourselves that children deserve more than protection from being abused or exploited. Boys and girls need support from people like you and me to empower them, support them, and to help them to define their own lives. Thank you for listening. Over.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador. And then I will hand over directly to my colleague, Joel Åström, who is responsible for our work in Thailand.
Yes, thank you, Britta. Thank you, Jon, as well, for a good introduction to today's session. My name is Joel Åström. I'm a program manager and project lead at the World Childhood Foundation, working with Britta. And I will, over the coming 10-15 minutes or so, talk a bit about risks for children during and after the current pandemic. Mention a few areas of concern now that travelers are starting to return, but also focus finally on a few key things that all can do to help protect children, like Jon just mentioned. So can we start the presentation there? Yes, thank you. Maybe next one, or next slide. Yes, thank you. So basically we still don't know the full impact of the pandemic, and it's still ongoing very much. But we do know that the socio-economic impact has been massive. And we do also know that it's been largest, the impact has been largest for the world's poorest and most vulnerable groups, including children. And I will not stay too long on this, but and you all know this, but some estimates indicate, for example, the loss of about 200 million jobs worldwide. In the global tourism industry, about 60 or 80%, according to some estimates, or 60 to 80% of jobs in the tourism industry has been lost already by 2020, last year. So many people are falling back into poverty as a result of this, or have in other ways had to find ways to survive by taking loans, for example. And another consequence has also been an increase of violence reported from a number of countries across the globe. And one key message from us has all along been that this pandemic is dangerous for children, although they might not be the worst hit from a medical perspective. So the children are mostly impacted by socioeconomic effects and the impact on their caregivers. Violence, we also know the violence, abuse, and neglect and exploitation of children tend to increase drastically in crisis, and we've seen this also this time. A few things that we have highlighted and continue to do are on the slide there, where lockdowns and isolation can be connected to increased violence against children, not least for children where the violence comes from within the family. Of course, being locked into your home where there's a violent family member is very dangerous. And we can also see now that new studies show that violence in the home has been reported much more during times when schools have been closed, for example, and also from families where there has been income loss or unemployment among caregivers. The lack of access to safe adults is another key thing for children, where we know how important the relation to one or several trusted and safe adults is for children, not least those who have problems at home or in other ways face difficult circumstances. And during the pandemic, with these lockdowns and restrictions, many children have lost the contact to these adults and these people outside of the inner circle of their families, for example. And we also see that, or believe that, this caused the drop of reports that we saw in some countries during parts of the pandemic, like reports to the police or social services, for example. We see also that children have spent more time online as a consequence, and this both because of online schooling, but also lack of other activities, sports, for example. And this poses certain risks, and we know from Interpol and others that there has been increased activity both in the dark web and the open web among offenders looking for children to abuse, and the sharing of child abuse material. Family separation is another thing that we've talked a lot about. Of course, this is relevant in most types of crises, both because parents or caregivers can be infected and become seriously ill, but also because, as a consequence of the unemployment, for example, many caregivers need to migrate or move in search of work and might leave their children behind. Or forced to send their children to residential care institutions because of poverty if there are no other options available. And the lack of support also, the pandemic has really demonstrated that in many places the lack of support services already before the pandemic was highlighted, and of course not then available also during this crisis. And one thing that we see is also that one of the most frequently disrupted services has been home visits for women and children at risk of abuse. Next slide, please. In Thailand, this development and the dynamics has very much mirrored those from the experience in other countries that I just mentioned. Although, of course, countries like Thailand that are so dependent on tourism has been hit extra hard, you could say. And I mean, of course, this global lockdown basically and travel restrictions basically meant that tourists disappeared overnight. It was down 99% tourist arrivals in September, I think, this year compared to before the pandemic. There are reports also in Thailand about increased levels of violence against children and a drastic increase in deaths. And we also hear that from many of our partners working across the country that the caseload has been heavily increased during the pandemic. The biggest impact has also in Thailand been on the most vulnerable parts of the population, including informal sector workers, migrant workers, and children whose parents have been affected. In Thailand, there's been long periods of tough restrictions and lockdowns, also affecting children, of course. School closures now only open since November after a long period. And it's not yet really clear what the impact of this has been. And how the online options have worked, but also how many and children will actually return now that schools are opening up again. We see also an increased number of reports to hotlines. Childline Thailand, that I think are also listening here today, has recorded a large increase in the number of calls to their hotline. Friends International Thailand has also seen an increase in the number of calls, including questions and discussions about mental health and domestic violence. Online abuse, I mentioned, Kun Boom from the Hug Project will talk about this shortly, but there seems to be a clear increase also in Thailand, with some figures talking about or saying that there has been about a 40% increase in the number of tips in 2020 in Thailand. Yes, next slide, please. So, I mean, we're now basically 2 years into this pandemic, and we are seeing tourists slowly returning to countries like Thailand. And with this increased poverty and the vulnerability that I just talked about, we also see that this will pose certain risks for children that needs to be addressed. Now, we're already beginning to hear about the increased number of cases involving travelers abusing children that Jon also mentioned. But we also see that many, both children and adults, may end up in exploitation because of debts and poverty. And we saw already before the pandemic that dynamics and behaviors were changing. And the problem of sexual exploitation linked to traveling as such didn't really disappear even before or now during the pandemic, but it really just changed form. And I think a key thing to remember here is that the demand for children to abuse has not decreased. And I think this is also illustrated by this increased activity, on online forums, the exchange of child abuse material, or what we used to call child pornography. I mean, and so we're seeing this, and also the risks now that countries are opening up and that traveling is becoming possible again. What will happen then? But I mean, on a positive note, there has been many good efforts over the years, and we can also see that this has given really positive results. I mean, in the past, offenders often contacted children and directly on the streets or in public places, but this is not really done in most places anymore because of the risk of being arrested and how that has increased a lot. You cannot really usually, it still happens, but it's much more difficult than it used to be. But despite this and many other also good things that have happened, also relevant in Thailand, there are a number of concerns, not least now. And I think one of these that we saw before the pandemic is the increased traveling as such. And I put that in brackets because, of course, over the past 2 years, there's been basically no traveling. But I think we also can expect a return to those levels, although it will take time. And we're traveling more than we've ever done before, really, at least before the pandemic. It's cheaper than ever. We're traveling more long distance and so on. And that also means more people are arriving. Another thing is these new types of travel products that we saw and that we expect to continue now that tourists are returning, and that also pose, I mean, all of this with traveling and tourism, it also gives a lot of positive effects, of course, not least economically for a country like Thailand, cultural exchange and so on, but there are also a number of risks that we need to be aware about. And I think one thing here in terms of new travel products, new behavior, expectations, experiences is, for example, linked to volunteering that has become very popular. We see that in volunteering in orphanages, schools, after school centers and so on, can be a positive experience, maybe mostly for the volunteer, but it also puts children at quite high risks, with many of these receiving places not really having control over who they are receiving, and it really gives possible offenders easy access to children without parental oversight. And we know that this is also a key part of a strategy for many offenders to look for opportunities where you can approach and build relations to children that are not really protected. Another thing is these type of shared services. You can say, like, Airbnb can be one example, where you kind of rent a private individual's house, for example, and how that really goes around existing routines and guidelines for who you can bring to your room and so on. Community-based tourism and homestays, things like that have been popular in Thailand and been a key part of the strategy to get tourists to visit new areas of the country, which can be very good, of course, but also pose certain risk when lots of travelers visit remote areas where people have a little awareness of risks. And overall, this independent traveling patterns we see, there's much less group tours compared to before, and that also means less insights. So we have also seen before the pandemic, and we expect this to continue, that offenders change their modus operandi in a number of ways to make detection more difficult, including more advanced grooming techniques, more long-term residents, for example, or returning visitors, where you can build relations to whole communities in many cases, volunteering in places where you can have easy access to children has been part of these examples. We also see a number of concerning overlaps with the use of new technology and how this is used to contact, groom, and abuse children. And we will hear a bit more about that shortly, but we need to know more about this basically, and we will hear more. So maybe the next slide. Yeah, this was a quote just illustrating the point I just made from a report about Cambodia we released last year, where one of the frontline workers we interviewed basically just confirmed that offenders have new strategies to build trust with organizations as volunteers or staff and have access to children. As accessing children on the streets became more difficult, they use new ways to groom children and families. Yeah. All right, next slide. So I will talk now for a little bit about what you can do, because the title of this webinar is Protecting Children During COVID-19, What Can You Do? And it's fairly basic, but still very important. And I think the people listening today are a mixed group, both from travel sector, private individuals, company representatives, and the embassy. I think the last one, you can go back. But of course, these different roles mean that you can do different things to help protect children. And one overall thing, maybe you go back to the slide before. Thank you. Yeah. And one overall thing here is that protecting children from harm is everyone's responsibility, not just us who work directly with child protection in civil society, in law enforcement, social services, etc. Everyone needs to help. And one key thing here is by reporting suspicions that children are being abused or that there are in risk situations. And many professionals in this field also rely on reports to be able to act. Now, this can be a bit more complicated than it sounds, but overall, it's important to remember that your tip can be the last part of a puzzle and contribute to the arrest of an offender. So I will not go into detail, but we recommend that you contact local police. There are ways to report both directly to them. There's the 1300 hotline, for example, but also tourist police. If that's not possible, there are other options, for example, language barriers or so. But I think this is also a part or a point where companies and the embassy and other authorities play a really important role to help guide people who have seen something or want to understand what they can do to act, because it's not always that easy. So to have routines and a clear understanding of the recommendation for how to react. And if there's a foreigner involved, I think you can also reach out directly to police in other countries. It's also important to know, for example, to the Swedish police. There are a few tips here on the slide, what you can include, but the more details, the better, of course. But the most important thing is to react and report. And now we can go to the next one. So just talking a little bit about the different groups of people listening in today. I think for individuals and long-term residents in a country like Thailand, for example, I think key pieces of advice from us would be to have an updated understanding. This is still happening. Look beyond the stereotypical pictures of the normal offenders. It's not only older white men, for example. We know the majority of travelers in Asia, for example, are from Asian countries. But also then report children at risk in the best way, depending on the situation. For the travel sector, it's important to develop policies to ensure that travel products don't cause harm to children, so that you don't have orphanage visits, for example, or the message you give your customers, in situations where there's begging children, for example. Train staff on risk for children, inform customers, and have clear reporting guidelines, internal, external. For the private sector in other fields, I mean, it's not as easy, but I think ensuring that production or products don't cause harm to children is one thing, of course. Sharing information with employees is another. Travel policies, reporting guidelines, and routines. And I think I just want to mention one example here is that we partnered with Securitas Thailand a few years ago, just before the pandemic, actually. And after meeting them and talking about this, we agreed that, or they agreed really, that it was a good idea to train all of their 4,000 plus security guards across Thailand on basic child protection, so that they would have more information and more, a better understanding of how they could actually contribute and react if they saw children at risk. So that was just started before the pandemic, and we hope that we continue now. I think another important part here is to have support to professional organizations as part of CSR, so that you don't have support for orphanages, for example, where we know that children are separated unnecessarily, but also put children at increased risk. For embassies and other authorities play a really important role, and we know that foreigners in other countries tend to turn to embassies for advice when they see something concerning, or if they want to report suspicions, for example. So it is really important that embassies are aware of the situation and of these areas of concern, and that they have clear advice about and routines about how to act if something comes in information-wise. So that could be one thing, and informing also citizens in the country you're based in. Yes, next one. I'm almost at the end. These are a few examples of initiatives, mostly targeting the travel industry, but this can also be used by companies in other areas. The code is an initiative from ECPAT International, or from ECPAT, you could say, to provide awareness and tools and support to prevent sexual exploitation. Child Safe is an initiative under Friends International, training companies about best practice and how to reduce risk for children. And this blue box there, the blue picture at the bottom was developed in 2018, and it's quite practical, so I like that one a lot. It contains lots of useful information and advice that can be used by companies also outside the travel industry. The next one is here. These are 7 tips for travelers, developed by Friends International, also that we partner with under this special initiative. It's quite basic, but a good list of things that you as a traveler can think about. And then for the last slide that I have, is with reporting advice for Thailand. And we can share, we have developed a little flyer, especially for Thailand, where this is on the back, with advice and points of contact if there are suspicions. So I think I'm out of time and we'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Joel. We have a question from the audience and I will soon let you in. But first, you mentioned, I think twice, but briefly, that you shouldn't give money to begging children. Why?
Well, we see, I mean, it can be a tricky moral dilemma possibly, but what we see is that not least in areas where there's lots of tourists, the amounts these children can collect in a day can be really high, and actually that gift or the money that you give to begging children then will really lead to them staying on the streets and out of schools and in really dangerous situations. So that's really the bottom line, is that instead try to find a professional local organization or in other ways that kind of try to work with the child and their family in a more holistic way and trying to get them off the streets rather than keep them there. So even if it can feel like a good idea and something that would, possibly help them return home that very day or that evening, we see that 5 minutes later there's another group of tourists or visitors that will give them more money. So, and that also makes the work of our partners, frontline social work, child protection workers, more difficult, because if the child earns more money than the parents in the end, it's really hard to convince them to put them back in school, for example.
Thank you. We have a question or a comment from Hotikorn. I don't know if you can put on your mic. Is that possible, Jeanette? Yes. Please. Or you can write your question. Is it possible to put on the mic? Now, go ahead. From Hotikorn? No. Okay, you can write your question in the chat then. We have another question in the chat, and I will actually give that to Clara. So Clara Ludvigsson from ECPAT Sweden. There is a question in the chat. What does the law say if a Swedish tourist is arrested for sexual abuse on children in Thailand? Is it Thailand's law that rules or Sweden's? Which way is heaviest?
Which heaviest? Oh,
yes. So is it
yes.
the person put in prison? Is the person put in prison in Thailand, or can he serve his time in a Swedish prison, and in that case often be let out earlier than the set time?
So I can answer to the extent of my knowledge. So my name is Clara, as Britta said. I'm a lawyer with ECPAT Sweden. I'm specialized in sexual exploitation of children. So if a Swedish national is arrested in Thailand, I mean, Thai law is applicable. So that person can definitely go to jail in Thailand for sexual crimes against a child. However, our problem and why we are in this program, to put a light on this very important topic, is that many people actually get away. So they aren't arrested in Thailand, and so they travel back home to Sweden and they aren't arrested, which is why it's so important to know that in Sweden and in many countries, especially all the EU countries, but also many Western countries, there is something called extraterritorial legislation, which means that even though the crime took place in Thailand, you can be arrested, prosecuted, and tried in Sweden for sexual crimes against children. So this is very important to know, because we know that many people go to certain countries, for example, Thailand or Southeast Asian countries, because they know they can get away with it. So this is why it's important to notify authorities, also the embassies, if you have suspicions when it comes to a foreigner, because they are experts on getting away, basically. And we know that many also do. I don't know if that answers the question.
I think so. So maybe you want to expand a bit on how Sweden can take the responsibility for traveling offenders. You did say a bit about that. Do you want to expand?
Yeah, so I think it's very important to know that this crime doesn't happen in Asia because of cheap flights or because children live in poverty. It exists because there's a demand, and this is quite a tough information, but we who work with this topic know this firsthand, that there is really a demand for children for sexual purposes, and cheap flights or children living in poverty are facilitating factors. The reason why is because there are grown-ups who will conduct this crime, but there are facilitating factors, and the offenders are very well aware of them. So that means we as Swedes have a huge responsibility in protecting children from our own nationals abroad. And one way is this extraterritorial legislation that I was mentioning before, that we actually have this very far-reaching legislation when it comes to sexual crimes. So this means that a Swede who exploits a child for sexual purposes all around the world, in Thailand or otherwhere in the world, can be prosecuted in Sweden.
Thank you. And you will previously mentioned that we need to look beyond the stereotypical idea of who is the offender, but who are they? What do we know about that?
Yes, that is very, very important, because when we look at the stereotypical offender, we miss many children who are being victims of the non-stereotypical offender, like Joel was mentioning, perhaps a very young person who goes to volunteer abroad, or either in an orphanage or at an English school, or so on. But what we do know, we have very few convictions, unfortunately, and this is what we want to raise awareness about this issue. We have some convictions, and if we look on the Swedish convictions and the Nordic convictions, we see that people who have been convicted have been males so far. We know females also travel to exploit children, but so far all the convictions have been on male offenders. We also know that they really like to travel to countries with a sort of lack of control when it comes to this topic. So they like Southeast Asia, they like Thailand, and they like the Philippines, but there are examples of this all over the world. We also know that many return, they find a favorite spot, a favorite region where they will return to. We also know that some even marry local women just in order to access the children. And we also know that, I mean, when you talk about the traveling offender, it's not a type of a person, it's a type of a behavior, because this is a person with a behavior that is sexually interesting towards children. And we know that they often film or take photos of the abuse, because this is also a valuable currency in these offender forums where they can trade pictures with each other. So it's also one type of offense is often, they don't stop with one type of offense. It's usually correlated with other types of offenses. So what Joel mentioned earlier in the law is called child pornography.
Thank you. And as we have mentioned in different ways, that it's not very easy always to know when to report, and maybe often it feels that I don't really know what I saw. So what's your comment on that?
Well, my comment is, this is a serious topic and it's a serious crime, but it can be prevented, and it's so important that people actually trust their gut instinct, that maybe this didn't feel right and act on it, because it's not the responsibility to investigate the crime if you see something, but it is a responsibility in our opinion to report, because when you have reported, you have done sort of your bit, and then it's the police whose responsibility is to investigate. And if the suspicion turns out to be nothing, then there won't be an investigation. But sometimes, and we have examples on this, that one tip is the last piece of the puzzle that the police needed. So we see firsthand how important it is to report this type of crime.
Thank you, Clara. And we will come back to you and to these discussions later in the meeting. But now I would like to hand over to Anna Ekstedt, Ambassador at Large for Combating Trafficking. So we understand now that Sweden has the legislation to ensure that Swedish perpetrators can't get justice, even if the country where they perpetrated the crime would not prosecute. But what more is Sweden doing to prevent child sexual abuse and exploitation? And what is your role in that, Anna?
Thank you so much, Britta. And good morning and good afternoon, everybody. Yes, my name is Anna Ekstedt, and I'm the Swedish ambassador to combat trafficking in persons. And the reason why we have a specific ambassador to address trafficking is because it's a high priority, of course, for the Swedish government to work against all forms of trafficking in human beings. Trafficking is one of the worst crimes that we have. Actually, it's a serious violation of human rights, and it often involves serious organized crime as well. And looking specifically at children, of course, it's one of the worst forms of violence against children that are happening today in our world. And children are unfortunately exploited both for sexual purposes, but also for forced labor. They are forced to beg, as we heard also here earlier, and forced to be involved in other forms of criminal activity. It could be related to drug production and being drug mules, etc. And also organ removals, unfortunately. And the list is long when it comes to the different purposes that people could be trafficked. And it's also unfortunately clear, as we also heard this morning, that we're not doing enough to prevent this crime and to protect victims of the crime. And as we also heard, a high number of victims in the world, unfortunately, are children. The recent reports from the UN shows that 1/3 of all the identified victims in the world today are children. And it's extremely difficult to give numbers because we know this is an underreported crime and very few victims are actually being identified. You see from the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, the latest report, talk about around 50,000 people in the world being, during 2018, were identified globally. And then we know this is a very, very small percentage that actually is being identified formally by the sort of authorities in the countries around the world, and that gets a status as victims of trafficking. The numbers usually we hear that at any given time, 25 million people in the world are being victims of trafficking. And also that around $150 billion are sort of the income annually for organized crime in trafficking people in the world. And then if we see that then 1/3 of all these victims are children, it's far too many. And children are especially being exploited for sexual purposes, both boys and girls. When you look at the numbers, the majority of the identified victims are children, but we know as well that many boys are being exploited, maybe not being identified to such a large extent as girls. And also, as we heard earlier today, that the COVID-19 pandemic has further worsened the situation, that traffickers have now found new ways to exploit people, to recruit people from the growing risk groups in our society. They have changed they are unfortunately highly adaptable to new conditions and finding new ways to groom and to recruit victims online. And as we also heard, is lockdowns have made children have been more online, and then also traffickers can find them. They could either go, as you usually talk about online, they can go hunting for specific victims, or they could go fishing in a way that they sort of actually either go directly targeting victims, trying to groom them or recruit them online in one way or the other, or that they actually put out an ad that children would look at that looks like something completely different, and then it's a way to recruit them into trafficking. And of course, to do something against this, it's clear that we need to have a more of a whole of society approach. that ensures relevant child rights and also gender-sensitive responses and legislation. And as Clara also mentioned, this is a demand-driven crime. Trafficking exists due to the fact that there is a demand. And we have to acknowledge this, and not only acknowledge it, but also act and react on the fact that there is a high demand for sexual exploitation of children. And it is difficult. It is still taboo around the world to talk about these issues, but we need to talk about these issues and actually also find sort of functioning models that could address the demand and how we do this jointly. And maybe just say what trafficking actually is, because trafficking, it sounds, the English word trafficking is different from the Swedish, människohandel, maybe in the sense that trafficking sounds like it has to be something that is cross-border, that you actually transporting a person from one country to another or within a country. Quite often there is some kind of transportation, but you said that there needs to be an act that you actually recruit, transport, transfer, harbor, or receive a child. And the purpose is exploitation, and that exploitation could be for different purposes. And here today we talk about the sexual exploitation. But actually there is no movement that is required. There could be an online exploitation that could be trafficking. For example, these kind of online abuses that are ordered by one person being based, for example, in Sweden, and the actual exploitation is being done somewhere else. These things can also be trafficking. So I think this is important so commercial sexual exploitation and trafficking in human beings are often very interlinked and could be the same. So what needs to be done then? Clearly a lot needs to be done. When we talk about trafficking, we usually talk about prevention, protection, prosecution, and partnership. And I just want to say a few words about prevention and partnership especially. And it's clearly, like I mentioned this, that the best way to prevent this crime is to address the demand. And this is not something that is voluntarily. Actually, all UN member states who have signed the UN protocol against trafficking has a clear obligation to address demand for trafficking for all forms of exploitation. And this needs to be done, whether it's via legislation or via other forms of social, cultural, or educational initiatives. And when it comes to trafficking in children, of course, everyone agrees that there has to be a zero tolerance for the demand for children for sexual exploitation. And the legislation is in place, but still more needs to be done to address sort of cultural norms or talk about these issues, how we actually efficiently can prevent this. And it's clear that we need to have knowledge sharing with a wide range of actors, like you're doing here today, that we need to include many actors who can prevent directly in a case, act directly in a case, but also in prevention. And here we do need to work together with schools, with media, with children's organizations, youth organizations, academia, as well as health sectors. And embassies, of course, also play a crucial role, and travel agencies, of course. And also just to mention maybe that there was a UN high-level meeting in New York 2 weeks ago, where trafficking specifically was discussed, and the demand was in high focus. The fact that we need to do something more to address the demand on a global level. All member states have this obligation, and the UN is there to support member states in doing this. And also then the online dimension. Clearly, something needs to be done. Everyone talks about the increase of online exploitation, but do we have the tools? Legislation is on the way on EU level, but we need to do something more, working with platforms providers and social media providers in order to make sure that online can be a safe space and a space for prevention rather, and also a way for sort of identifying the exploiters rather than for the exploiters and perpetrators to identify the children. And then maybe the role of embassies, of course, local cooperation with the relevant actors and keeping this issue high on the agenda, and also being aware of the local conditions in the country where the embassy is based and who to report to, etc. Those kind of procedures needs to be clear. And the Swedish MFA has developed an internal training tool on trafficking in human beings, on how to work with these issues, both in direct cases, but also on a more sort of long-term prevention scale. I also just want to mention that we're also working on, there is already a handbook for consular staff and diplomat staff on how to address trafficking in human beings and identify and assist victims of trafficking. And we're also working on updating this handbook, so that could also be distributed. And I'm also thinking like embassies could work with other embassies in their different networks, and to say, for example, say what you saw, could that be a model for other embassies on a more EU-wide level or with other countries? But we need to, when we talk about these issues, we need to address the fact that it's a human rights violation. Children's rights are being violated. No children should be exploited sexually. They all have right to redress, access to justice, trauma-based support when they have been exploited. And yeah, just to make sure that children are protected against this crime. And in that, we need to work together. I think I will stop there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Anna. And I think the last point is really the key one in its kind of simpleness, that children in Thailand and Cambodia and the Philippines, there are not other children than the Swedish children. They don't have other needs or other rights. They have the exact same rights. And actually, often when we speak about this work, and now we've had a lot of Swedish representatives from civil society and government speak, but often when we talk about this, we get the question about, what about Thailand? What about the Thai government and civil society? Are they not doing anything? And the answer is obviously yes, they do a lot also to combat this issue in their own country. And they are both working to support children and identify and prosecute perpetrators. And we have with us Boom from the HUG project, which is a partner of Childhood and also a key actor in this regard, since you're both working directly with children and families, as well as strengthening in the capacity of law enforcement. So we have talked a lot about the risks with traveling offenders, but also, as you mentioned, that we've heard reports about the exploitation moving more and more online. Is that the case in Thailand? What trends do you see, Boom? And what do people need to know in order to address those risks? Welcome, Boom.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning in Sweden. Thank you so much. It's an honor to share with everyone today. I saw some names that I couldn't know why people behind the legislation, amendment, and Ilya, who fight for children. So thank you, and thank you all the participants at home. So today I was assigned to talk about the child abuse online, new technology and new risks. If I start to take up the time, just send me the heart sticker emoji or something. Okay, so the project, our goal is to prevent, protect, and restore children from child sexual abuse, human trafficking, and also online sexual abuse. As the COVID-19 strike, you see every year each year since 2019 up to 2021. Even 2021, we, just December, and the tips have rise. The tips, what I mean is the statistic from the national, the NCMEC National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and also the government, especially police, has their own Facebook page. So they receive tips online through Facebook and Twitter. So they're very active. And since the amendment of the possession of the child pornography law, which Kun Snow White was actively involved in, we This year, the scene that the rise in report has doubled every year. I try not to send the number of the tips, but trying to show in the percentage. But the percentage is from where, like tech company, responsible tech company, but we're talking about there's so many that are not, reporting or having transparency report. So there's so much more that under report that is not shown in here. So these are just the one that is shown. For example, ThaiCat this year, from NECMEC, they received over 300,000 tips already. And also from their Facebook page, we got the stats that they got the tips for about 357 cases, and 45 are directly from children. However, they were able to prosecute 35 cases from 47 children who reported, but the rest are reported. But we need to see sometimes right now Thai people are so active on Twitter, and Twitter is used so much to like help and protecting children. When they see something, they report it, which is great. So sometimes like one case, but 300 people saw it, so that like hundreds of reports that came to ThaiCat, but from one case. So with the online sexual exploitation we see in Thailand currently, from I'm talking about the situation last year and this year. So we started to see online live streaming using children. Like we have like live streaming of a Thai lady who recruit 3 girls to do live streaming, and so many like maybe 30,000 members that watch that live stream. And we see like countries from a lot from Southeast Asia, not just Thailand, who are the viewers. And we see that if online streaming, we can, if the police arrest, they can be charged under human trafficking, because it's with recruitment and, like gaining, income and exploiting children, make money from the live streaming of children. Children in Thailand are anyone under, 18 years old in this one. So, and we see that an increasing number of sexual abuse of children within the family, and then posts in Chiang Mai, especially during COVID. We find more last year, actually early this year in the southern, the ThaiCat has rescued a 4-year-old. And the person who took her photo and uploaded online was her own father. Yeah, so see, we can see that it's complicated without, the good thing is Thailand make an MOU with the NECMEC, so they can access, the lawyer police can access the report direct. You can see that this little girl would not be able to make a report on her own or ask for help. She wouldn't know if this is wrong, right? Therefore, having a responsible tech company who make a report to NECMEC make a lot of difference, help us rescue many young kids. So, we have 4 years old, and we haven't had a baby cases yet, but 4 years old in these past 2 years, and 7. And this year we see 9 years old is the youngest. But also another case that made me cry was in January this year, January 8th, I remember. It was a 7-year-old girl. The tips was alerted to police by the mom, by the friend of the mother. She saw the Facebook chat of the mom and the offender now. She's already convicted. So with this case, we charged under human trafficking because of we have to thank the tech company, who gave the evidence that would lead the police to make a proper prosecution. As we see that it's more complicated, and it's and the offender now started to use online exploitation because it's faster. Like in the past, we're trying to lock the kids in the house if the parents are we don't want our kids to be abused. They watch them. Okay, you can't go anywhere, stay home. But right now, home is not even safe. You know, perpetrator can go into the toilet, can go into the bedroom, right? So this is why that what we see is within the family, we need more collaboration with tech company. And we see that one offender can abuse many children. We had a 19 years old offender 3 years ago for a trafficking case that my team worked with ThaiCat. The victim reported to us in Chiang Mai. The investigation led to the arrest offender in the northeastern area. And then after the police says we do victim identification, it led to identification of the photo of 230 young boys who are students. We can see that one victim can abuse so many kids, and one offender abuse so many kids. And from the 5 years record statistic, we can see in Thailand, the majority of offenders are Thai national. Yet there are international offenders, but still low, still in the low, but the Thai the highest numbers of the arrest. And then also cases related to child abuse is involved online, sexual exploitation. We see that now. In the past, when there's no online, they just do the sexual abuse in the room, right? But now when they abuse children, so many offenders also make a video and filmed it. And I remember, I think last year or 2 years ago, they just amended that with sexual abuse and making a video, the penalty will be higher. And also in Thailand, what we see like surface web is still preferred target of most online predators than dark web, because it's so easy. You can go to, like open or Google or anything. It's just easy to find. And dark web, because it goes through so many IP address, so make it slower. So many perpetrator may not prefer, because once you connect to the dark web, and also need a high skill. There are a few dark web cases that we work with the Homeland Security Investigation or the FBI that work together. There's a few, but the majority, even with the surface web, we don't have enough manpower to, especially police, to do investigation. Yeah, so we see like last year during the COVID-19, the case rise so much, especially during April to June. They did 54 days, they did 53 cases in 24 provinces and arrest 44 arrests and 9 search. Search operation, when it says search and cannot arrest, because sometimes some offender like delete and formatted their device, so they know how to certificate it. So they have to, pack up and take it to the lab to do the more high-end, forensic investigation. And then last year, during the operation across the nation, so we see at least 100 children that the police were identified just within, less than 2 months. Yeah, and also victim age are getting younger. Like I just talked to my team that now we use Facebook and Twitter, but Facebook, Twitter, we can reach, children probably like 13 years old and up, but now we have many 9 years old reported from the game called Free Fire, maybe a few from TikTok, not a lot of TikTok, it's much more active now in their report, but the game, online game, Free Fire, Discord, we have seen a lot of these, but there's no transparency report or no connection from the tech company itself or, accountability. So that's why our team has come up with so many prevention and trying to use online methods to reach out to parents and target as many, in both quantity and quality. And you see, we just did I worked with the government to create the journey of, like what we have to do when they become online sexual exploitation, like from reporting to investigation and then arrest. And then this is what the victim has to go through, right? There's a journey, so many steps in the legal process. So we're trying to make it easy to see, say, kids make a report, police did the investigation, police did the search and arrest operation. After that, they go through the police inquiry, and prosecution will involve prosecutors and judges, execution, for like compensation, and then the aftermath, the life of the victims or survivor. Like for human trafficking cases in general, like when they end repatriation, restoration, right? But for sexual exploitation, it doesn't end here. The case finished in court 3 years ago. Right now, that photo was still circulated online. I still have to help my clients whose case closed 3 years ago because it's continued to circulate. And we see the sad part is sometimes the police did the investigation and make the arrest and find the same photo of the same young girl over and over. So it's been 5 years and she's still calling from the police, like, is this you? Is this your photo? Can you testify it for this case? So we're trying to work on how to minimize re-traumatization of, our clients. This one was just yesterday, working as multidisciplinary team. Sometimes the perception of people said, like, the police don't do much, but I can guarantee that the current one, since the Thailand Internet Crimes Against Children was established, they have done so much. They just can't post online. They just can't make a news, on the arrest because they don't want to affect the kids. Like this just yesterday, a boy was, posting to sell his friend online. And then we rescued 2 14-year-old girls, with just yesterday in Lampang. It worked as multidisciplinary team. It was well planned. It was quiet, no media. A successful case. So now the girls are under, our partner chapter protection. And as we see, what can you do? This is my last piece. What can you do? As Ms. Collar said, if you see it, report it. Prevention is key. We did the online training with the cyber TICAC and cyber police. What we did, we do the pilot test. We opened the online registration. Within less than 48 hours, 230 students signed up from all over Thailand. And it was such an amazing time, and the kids participate well. And we're trying, and even the kids actually share the methods and say, you need to know this app, you need to learn about this is so new. Because, they are our teachers as well. So not just learning from them, and, we can raise awareness and build the network. We have a group, actually communication group chat with them, online chat. And so like we can talk to children, and then we want to make the justice system more friendly, child-friendly justice. Is one psychiatrist told me, to make the police more friendly for the children, you need to make sure the kids access to them. They need to go to school, they need to see them. And after, actually, many of the children said to the police, like, we're gonna sign up again on your second round of training, the first round, they want to come back again. So I think that's great. And then like, they said like, oh, like I never imagined the police would be this, like nice and fun to be around. So it's child-friendly justice, not just through the legal, but through the prevention, through the training, whether the police and people in the justice system. And even we have done this to talk to the kids, these to make them like, you can access, you can get help, right? This is how we communicate to the children community. And we also, last year, with the funding from Childhood Foundation, let me show this real quick. This will be my last thing. We produce like a online interactive fiction, so they can go online and then they can pick something, pick girl, and then pick age. And we collect data. Have you been exploited? That's it. No. Exposed. You feel exposed. At first, I didn't like the name. In Thai, say, "มื่อคลิปหลุด" means when your clip was leaked online. I said, but I asked the survivor to help us name the book. This is a story. The survivor said, "I need this name, people, because when I went to Google, my video was leaked. I needed help. I searched on the hashtag on Google, said my clip was leaked. What happened was all the porn websites show up on Google." And she said, I was so traumatized when I asked for help. She said she wants to build hashtag. Said, "เมื่อคลิปหลุด" exposed, when you're online, that when victims go online to ask for help, and that the proper, channel will come up and not just, website or pornography. Yeah, so you can test it. My team will put it on, the website. The chat box. So this is a nice and friendly. 1 second. It's a nice and friendly handbook. You can go and download online. It's free. You can distribute it as much as you want. It was developed by prosecutors, police, and judges, a tech company as well. And we were sponsored by the childhood, World Childhood Sweden, and Swedish Embassy. We're so thankful. And the Prime Minister unit, delivery unit, see the importance of this, and they help. They're gonna help pay for the printing for more, so we can distribute. The cool thing is it's still being used. And actually, one girl was asking for help on Twitter, and our client used her avatar, like a fake account, and tweeted the handbook and tagged the other victim, said, "Read this if you need help, and you will know how to get help." And in that, and as you see in that, it gives where to report, so they go to the proper channel. And the exciting thing is the psychiatrist at Rama, the head doctor, she actually asked me for some copy, and she distributed it to the student who studied to be a psychiatrist. And then now the Thai Tech and Rama activity has been referring cases together, for children to get proper help. And I would say the quote said, the victim, everyone said, "My case happens 2 years ago. It feels just like yesterday." The victim said, one girl, when she cried, she said, "People, will I be able to wear a wedding dress? Will I be able to have a real relationship? Even though the boyfriend accepted me, but his family doesn't." So yeah, if you see it, report it, don't share it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Boom. And your sound was sometimes not perfect, but I hope that people understood and heard most of it anyway, because it's really interesting and important, and also wonderful to hear that so much is happening in the prevention and kind of increased capacity in Thailand. There was a question in the chat about where in Thailand online child sexual abuse happens mostly.
Where I think the social media, a lot of social media.
So yeah. It's not a particular region in Thailand. It is.
Yeah, it's not. I try not to use the name to, be respect to the company, because I know they help a lot. But they may use these social media to recruit children. These chat social media for money making. Does that make sense? And use these social media for advertisement. So it moved. Yeah, so they use different social media tools to, offenders just the same. As well, I said, maybe I have to go dance in TikTok and something like that to reach out to younger children. So we need to find everywhere where children go, right? Yeah.
Thank you so much. And actually, so now we have a couple of minutes or a bit more for questions and discussions. And I will do have some questions for the panelists, but we also have some good questions in the Q&A chat. And I also see that there are some some partners of Shiley that I see in the participant list. So if you do want to add something, we have partners working in Thailand in the online and offline field and in different parts of Thailand. So I will see if you want to add something to what has been said already. But first, I would like to pose the question to you, John, which is a question saying that the Swedish embassy in Bangkok represents Sweden in more and more countries in Southeast Asia. How does it affect your ability to meet these issues we're talking about today? You have manuals, but are they enough? Don't you need more people on the ground?
Thank you, Britta. I actually answered that question from Mr. Gustafsson in the chat, but so I can read my own answer. No, it's a very good question, and of course, as I think I wrote, I would never say no to additional resources being allocated to the Swedish embassy. But having said that, I think that we are actually, and I hope that no one is listening from the Ministry for Foreign Affairs in Stockholm when I say that we are sufficiently sort of resourced at the moment. I'm more worried about restrictions, current restrictions as regards traveling, because that affects all of what we are doing currently. I have not been able to go to Lao PDR. I have not been able to go to Myanmar. I've been able to visit some of the provinces here in Thailand, but there are many more that I need to visit. So that is affecting us more than the resources as of today. So, and we are very fortunate that we have a Swedish police officer at the Nordic Liaison Office that makes, if not all, so very much of the difference.
Thank you. And we have one question and one ask from Monia Lundgren. The ask is, she said that the presentation from you, Boom, was really interesting, but sometimes difficult to hear. So at least we can send out the slides. And the ask from Monia was, can you recap your presentation in writing? I don't know how possible that is, but we will try to share whatever we can. But there was also a follow-up question, I think, to what you said, Joel, about begging children. And Monia said, writes, is it mostly the case that children earning money will not attend school? Meaning children begging on the streets. If money from selling souvenirs or begging are no longer there, for example, will the children resort to maybe selling their bodies instead? I think that's a very important and relevant question. So Joel, can you start? And then if anybody else in the panel want to add something, maybe Clara or Boom?
Yes, all right. It's a difficult question to ask. I mean, of course, it is possible. I think what we do know is that children spending a lot of time on the streets is a really high-risk environment, also for being dragged into sexual exploitation or abusive situations. So a key part of interventions would be to get children off the streets and into, of course, schools or in other, support programs into a more safe environment. Of course, if the family would lose a key part of their income, they would need to look for other ways to make a living. So that we need to do both things at the same time. But I don't think we cannot argue that keeping children on the streets would be better than the alternative. We need to increase investments, though, and I think that's also clear in many countries across the globe, that the pandemic has really exposed weaknesses in social support systems. And so on, right? So we need to both increase regulation, social investments in social support, not least prevention, including social service, but also in law enforcement.
Thank you. Boom or Clara, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I can add. Actually, one of the concern that rise so much, especially during COVID, many children did advertise, like himself or herself to make income from like private live streaming. Yeah, which is, a concern as well, because like when, like you see children initiate, and how much we do want to make them criminal, right? And what's the law said and how do we deal with that? Because, it's like either prosecute the child or there's no, like no clear plan, which I would disagree about, prosecuting them. However, many of them that become victims of online sexual exploitation because they do private live streaming, and then that customer are the one who, make recording, right, and then expose them online. So that's the problem, and I see that there's a need to work on that, in terms of prevention. And the child gain, a lot of money. They can make like 1,000 or 2,000 baht per live streaming session, private live streaming, which is it actually put them at risk as well. Yeah.
Thank you.
Also, one more, my staff has posted in the chat of chat box for host and panelists that you can go to the link to download the handbooks.
Very good. Thank you. And maybe we should dwell a bit on this, and now I will ask you a really difficult question, but about this, the poverty issue. I mean, we do know that poverty is a risk factor, but for example, we were traveling in the Philippines together with you, Clara, and with Joel, and where live streaming is a huge problem, but there are a lot of really poor families that still do not exploit their children through live streaming. So what is there anything to say about, the balance or the weight? How important is poverty as a push factor for sexual exploitation? Clara, can I give that difficult question to you first?
Well, it's a very important question, and it's a very difficult question to ask, to answer. Just my 5 cents on it would be that, just like you said, Britta, we know that most poor people do not exploit their children. Just like most travelers who buy the cheap flight tickets to Asia are not exploiting children. But we have people who do exploit children, and we do have parents who do sell their children. And those are what I mentioned earlier, those facilitating factors, poverty. I mean, a person who would not be living in poverty might not sell their child. So poverty is a very important issue to tackle. And of course, there are no easy answers to how to tackle poverty, but that's one of those key issues. Like Anna Ekstedt mentioned, the holistic approach to this crime, that's one of those issues. We need stronger education, more research. We need stronger legislation. We need police cooperation. We need functioning social services, because there are those offenders, and there are those parents who would go to this extreme. So with that knowledge, we need to have other aspects of society to help when this is the case. Yeah.
Anna, do you want to add anything about that?
Yeah, maybe just to say that, of course, poverty is a push factor in the sense that families would be more prone to, or more desperate in a sense, to exploit their children and in order to survive. And also for traffickers, that they know that they could actually approach poor families or families with living under different difficult circumstances. But again, it's the demand. We have to see that there is the demand that actually is behind this crime always. And we see also this increase of online exploitation here in the EU and in Sweden as well. We hear that the Gender Equality Agency reported that we see young people being exposed, and they're being exposed on this TikTok. Young children, they're absolutely not in vulnerable conditions, but they are being lured into this by clicking on something, and also other young people who actually recruit them under false promises, etc. So, and again, it is the demands. We have to see see this and prevent this.
Thank you.
I think if I can also add something, maybe I think that question also speaks to the responsibility of governments. And we know that offenders will also target countries where there's weak regulation and legislation in place, and where it's easy, maybe the awareness about this crime and this kind of dynamic is low, for example, where the risk for being reported and arrested and prosecuted and so on is low. So I think that also speaks to the responsibility of governments to introduce legislation to make sure that children are protected. Not least, we know that these new forms of online related abuse situations is challenging, and where legislation in many countries is far behind. So that is one responsibility. I think that's also to add about what different stakeholders or actors can do. I think that's also a key area where embassies, foreign embassies, can intervene to help work with both law enforcement, with legislators and so on, to share experiences and to introduce both more effective measures for law enforcement to increase the risk of offenders being detected, but also the drafting of new laws and so on.
Thank you. A couple of years ago, there was the first global report on sexual exploitation of children in travel and tourism. And it kind of very simply concluded that most offenders who sexually exploit children do that because they have the chance and they know they can get away with it. And I think that is very clearly speaks about how it happens, but also that that's actually something we can change. We can reduce those opportunities, and we can make sure that they do not feel anonymous and safe. So we have talked about a different range of things that different stakeholders could do to reduce these opportunities and increase the risk for perpetrators to get caught. So before giving June the last words, I would like to ask the panelists to say, like, the short sentence, just what people should take with them when they go for Christmas holidays and where they travel or when they go out in Bangkok. What's your final tip or recommendation, or don't forget this or don't do this? Boom.
For me, actually, I just want to add on the poverty part. In sex trafficking, there's some push from poverty side, but in terms of online sexual exploitation that I worked the past 5 years, my clients are actually from high-end schools and they have access, and we rarely get kids that from poverty situation because they have no access to, very limited access to the internet, but the risk will be at the the free school, like the free internet at school, like after school, and the Thai school do not have internet filter. Yeah, so like we did like a free internet filter but we can't do in the whole country because it can be costly, right? So that's what the government needs to be responsible, that out of all the school that provide internet, it needs to be safe. It needs to be secure. We have one school, actually one teacher downloaded like 3,000 porn websites, things like that. That's one thing we want to recommend. And then
Thank you. I think I will stop you there, Boom, and just ask Clara, Joel, and Anna, say like 2 words or 1 sentence, if it's possible. Clara.
Should I start? Okay, so as I mentioned, it's a very serious crime we're talking about, but it can be prevented. So my concluding mark would just be to report any suspicious acts that you see, because not doing so is really just only helping the offenders get away.
Thank you. You were.
Yeah, I think well, I think that just that point about the joint responsibility of people from different lines of work and in different capacities, both as individuals and in companies and in the travel industry and so on, both to report, but also to think really about how production or products or behavior is affecting children, and see if there are ways to help mitigate risks for children. I mean, and also to remember that there are many good things being done, but that we need to constantly both raise this issue, highlight changing dynamics and behaviors and risks, but also kind of acknowledge that good things are happening. I mean, the question around the embassy capacity to work in different countries is interesting as well. But before the pandemic, we saw Myanmar, for example, as a risk country where there was a really big increase of the number of tourists and travelers entering a country with really basic infrastructure and low awareness. Now, of course, after both the pandemic and the coup, that has all changed. But I think we need to move quite quickly and continue investing both in social support interventions and new legislation, and in really good practices that we know work. For example, the placement of the Nordic liaison officers at the embassy that really facilitate investigations involving foreigners.
Thank you, Anna.
But I think everything has already been said here. But also your own slogan, "Say what you saw." That's really what we need to do. We need to act, react, and act, and also act on gut feelings and do not look away from what we see. But also, again, prevention, work on the demand. What models what models exist, and what can we do? And then we have to have a gender-sensitive approach and also see who is behind the demand. The majority of perpetrators also are men. Women are also involved in this as accomplices. But we also need to work on these and ensure that there is zero acceptance for any kind of exploitation of children. And also the fact that we have done so many things in terms of legislation, resources in this field, but still this is happening. So we really need to find cooperation models that are solid and that actually do work so we can stop this phenomena. And there we all have a responsibility, both on individual level, private level, and NGO and global level. So yes, a lot of work to be done.
Thank you. And the final word to you, Jon.
Thank you so much, Britta, and thanks to everyone for listening in and participating. I hope you have found it as useful as I have. And I would like to say also to those of you that work on these issues on a daily basis, let me express my admiration. You are true heroes, and your work is so important and deserves not only attention, but also full support, I think. Also, thanks to everyone for providing very concrete suggestions and recommendations to all of us on how we can act, or maybe how we should act. My personal opinion is that yes, this is a shared responsibility, but it's more than that. I think it's a shared duty, or rather an individual moral obligation, if you like. Anna and Clara mentioned about the need for a whole of society approach, and that is, of course, I totally concur with that. We need to work on all levels, but ultimately, at the end of the day, it's also about individual actions. It begins there and it ends with that. I think it's also very important to underline what was mentioned by Clara about the extraterritorial jurisdiction. Please keep that in mind. It's a crime also in Sweden or in another European country, even if it's not enforced maybe in a third country. We from the Swedish Embassy, I myself, we will continue to work together with partners, with anyone that shares our goals in this endeavor. We also will reach out to lawmakers here, because sometimes it's, even if you have the right legislation in place, it's about implementation sometimes. So this is something that we will continue to look into, and we will also work together with our colleagues in Stockholm, namely the Royal Thai Embassy in Stockholm, because there are relating issues when it comes to trafficking that we need to work together on. And just a final word, it's been mentioned by Joel and others. I think something like a seemingly insignificant piece of information can actually be that very last piece for the puzzle. So please also keep that in mind, all of us. Again, thank you so much. Over the cup.
Thank you.
Over.